Welcome back to our little assignment this week. Ask and you shall receive. A lot of you guys seem to want like a book recommendation video on literary theory and writing advice and all that stuff. And it just happened to be the case that I've been thinking about a very, very important problem lately. If you've been doing what I've been doing for the past 8 years, essentially just creating content, trying to sound interesting, more interesting than I am in real life, at some point you're gonna start to think to yourself, where is my space relative to all the other brilliant creators out there on YouTube? And I had a thought. I am the raccoon of BookTube. The kind of stuff that I'm interested in, they all reside in the dirtiest corners of a bookshop. The corner that virtually no one wants to dust or check out, which is the reference section of the bookshop. So in those sections, you're gonna see a whole lot of reference books on like Oxford English Dictionary. You're gonna see a lot of style manuals. You're gonna see a lot of the stuff that basically aren't that fun to read. But maybe it's just because my brain's wired in a strange way. But I find excessive value and fun out of reading these books. So eventually I reached the conclusion that no, my job is not to give you the most informed opinions about a book that I've read. I'm not a literary critic, at least not yet. My job is not to give you a comprehensive overview of the history of literature. My job is to visit those boring sections, the reference sections of a bookshop, and to distill everything that I've learned. And this has been a pretty consistent through line for the past 8 years. I pick a book from one of these sections, learn something that sane people would consider as boring or pedantic, and I try to make them fun. So in a sense, I'm substituting for your normal annoying English teacher who just takes the fun out of everything. So with that being said, I'm the raccoon who digs through all those dirty corners of reference books. I've been reading a lot of reference books lately. Partly is because I'm writing a book on how to read books, which requires me to almost read exclusively reference material for the better part of 6 months. So through the sifting process, a lot of these books are absolute bullshit. A lot of these books, yeah, they are very boring without giving much value. So as your local reference book raccoon person, here are 5 books that I've gathered from my extended survey, and I've distilled them down to 5 that are going to dramatically increase your reading comprehension and, of course, the way you write. Because if you think about it, reading and writing are 2 sides of the same coin. If you know how to read really well, you can employ some of those techniques of reading into your writing, so eventually you have this really beautiful symbiotic relationship between reading and writing, and before you know it, you can go ahead and craft a really elegant response or a really elegant insult in my YouTube comment section down below. So we're going to start with a good old classic called The Elements of Style by Strunk and White, and this is basically a series of notes that I think E.B. White took from Strunk's lectures, or it could be the other way around, I'm not really sure, but essentially all you need to know is that this book is so short you can read it over a weekend, but it contains some of the key elements of writing well. Look, as much as I appreciate convoluted prose to make myself seem smarter than I actually am, the end goal of writing is not to show off. The end goal of writing is actually to write something that a reader could follow. So in a sense, you need to craft your style according to your reader and not according to your ego. And this book did a really good job of drilling that lesson into my head. So alongside some like basic usage advice, like place a comma before a conjunction introducing an independent clause, or do not join independent clause with a comma, there's one chapter over here near the end of the book, which I think is just absolutely fantastic, called An Approach to Style, where E.B. White essentially said, if you want to find your style as a writer, if you want to write really well, focus on communication first. And if you know how to communicate your thoughts effectively and in a clear way, your style is going to magically emerge. Because now I feel like a lot of writers, especially the sort of stuff that I read on Substack from time to time, they always put more emphasis on style. The idea is a little bit confused. The paragraphs are organized in a weird way. So ultimately, this is a very nice guide on all the essential things that you need to be a more effective writer. It doesn't matter if you're writing birthday cards. If you want to become a better letter writer, if you want to write better emails, this book will give you all the tools that you need. And it's really short and it's really easy to finish. Moving on to something related to reading, this is How Fiction Works by the literary critic James Wood. And yes, it might look like a technical kind of book. And yes, the title seems like it's talking about one thing, but actually this is a collection of essays by James Wood. And it documents some of the key moments of his career as a literary critic. And he distills, decades of literary criticism experience in the series of really witty, and really easy to read essays. One of my favorite chapters from this book is called Form, and yes, I did use this book a lot for our Back to the Basics or the Essential series, but this chapter on form essentially made the argument that the role of fiction is actually to set certain boundaries around this world that is increasingly accelerating in terms of time. We don't exactly reflect enough to frame our lives instead of beginning, conflict, and endings, but fiction kind of does that for us. So it brings about a temporary stability of time in our lives. So our lives are not just kind of like Monday to Friday, whoosh, it's gone. And then where years turning to weeks and weeks turning to days and days turning to hours and all that kind of stuff. So alongside that insight in this book, you will start to see literature in a completely different way. So he goes through everything from narration to how dialogue works, to how language works in a piece of fiction, to how literary forms impact your reading experience. And essentially, the impulse that I had after reading this book is to revisit all the books that I've read before. Maybe I've missed a lot of things because now Wood pointed it out. And it's just so fascinating to see a seasoned literary critic's mind at work because he really did the work of breaking everything down in a very understandable way. So, highly recommend it if you're into literature. Next one on our list, Beginning Theory by Peter Barry. You know what they all say, don't trust anyone with two first names. But I think I'd have to make an exception for Peter Barry because this might just be one of the most succinct introductions to literary history. If you know anything about literary theory, you'd also know that it's a very, very divisive subject. It divides people into basically two camps, right? People who hate lit theory and people who love lit theory to a dangerous level of devotion. Basically, a lot of the major events in literary theory happened between the 1920s to the 1980s. And now literature departments and faculties are basically either dealing with the fallout of literary theory or trying to repair literary theory to do what it's supposed to do. But the sad thing is, literary theory is not widely taught in universities. There are certain classes tucked away in hidden corners of the world that would give you a really comprehensive understanding of theory. But given that the field itself is kind of imploding already, given that it's quite a controversial field, so it's not that easy to find a university class or a college course completely dedicated to explaining the history of literary theory. So if you're interested in something like Freudian criticism, if you're interested in Jacques Derrida's works, if you're interested in psychoanalytical criticism, all that stuff falls under the umbrella of literary theory. As you can see here, we started from theory before theory, and we moved on to structuralism. And as the list moves on here, you have major movements like postmodernism. You have psychoanalytic criticism, feminist criticism, queer theory, Marxist criticism, new historicism, and cultural materialism. So if you want an understandable summary of all these major movements in literary history, in literary theory between the 1920s to the 1980s, this is basically one of your essential readings. And Peter Barry did such a brilliant job at articulating some of these really, really difficult concepts because if you go read like Jacques Derrida, for example, you won't be able to make sense of anything that he's writing about because literary theory also comes with a baggage of using very convoluted and unnecessarily pedantic language. But Peter Barry, even though he has two first names, did a brilliant job at summarizing all of these movements and theories. And if you read this book carefully, it might just hold the key for you to appreciate literature from a theoretical angle. Even though it's a very readable book, it is by no means an easy read, so still break out your highlighter, still break out whatever reading tools that you have to give this book all you have. But in terms of explaining theory, as a secondary resource for you to understand what the hell happened between the 1920s to the 80s in literature, read this book. It's going to change your life. As speaking of life-changing, The Elements of Eloquence by Mark Forsyth is pretty close to the top of my list in terms of some of the favorite books I've read this year. Let me ask you a question. Why do certain phrases in the English language stick out more than others? For example, we always remember something like I Have a Dream by Martin Luther King, right? We always remember Bond, James Bond. And we always remember, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. The immediate impulse is for us to attribute these memorable quotes to the genius of the writer. You know, JFK had a brilliant script writer or a speech writer, or Dr. Martin Luther King was a very, very proficient orator. But in this book, The Elements of Eloquence, Mark Forsyth basically said that, you know, the reason why we remember these lines is because these lines are examples of rhetorical devices that have been lost in a winds of history. Bond, James Bond, that's diacope. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what we can do for your country. That is called a chiasmus. And the repetition of I have a dream, I have a dream, I have a dream, that is called an anaphora. So all these crazy Greek-sounding names are actually figures of rhetoric. But for some reason, we just seem to believe that writers just pulled it out of their asses without realizing that some of the most memorable lines in lyrics, in movies, or in novels, they actually adhere to some of the rules of rhetoric. So in this brilliant little book, Mark Forsyth introduced us to some of these literary devices. There's hyperbaton, there's periodic sentences, diacope, rhetorical questions, basically all the stuff that you found extremely boring when you were in high school because there was no context. But Forsyth is going to give you all the context. He grounds everything in his really light and witty voice, and you'll find yourself laughing out loud reading this book. It is seriously that fun. And what's even more fun than just the writing alone is that after you've read this book, you're going to find yourself picking up all sorts of rhetorical devices around you. For example, you see an advertisement, you're like, shit, that looks like an anaphora. Or there's a movie line that's always stuck in your head. And you think to yourself, shit, that looks like a chiasmus. On the one hand, yes, you do run a risk of turning into someone who's absolutely insufferable. But on the other hand, it's just going to give you that kind of clarity. It's going to make you fall back in love with language. And it's going to undo a lot of the trauma that your high school English teacher had bestowed upon you to drain all your passion for the study of rhetoric. Because yeah, isn't that the whole point of getting into reading? Having fun? Figuring out how language works. So if all that stuff tickles your fancy, definitely read this. This is a very short book, barely 200 pages long. You can read this in a week, over the weekend, and it will change the way you write. There's going to be a period where you're going to start to pick out these rhetorical devices in how you speak and how you write. And of course, if you deliberately employ some of these devices in your writing, it's going to help you turn the perfect English phrase. And now, speaking of rhetorical devices, we have Steven Pinker's The Sense of Style. And the reason why my copy is so clean is because I've actually read this book on Kindle. And I think this might just be one of the most important guides if you want to write for a 21st century audience. For context, Steven Pinker is a Harvard-trained psychologist who specialized, or later specialized in linguistics as a window into human psychology. And over the years, during his tenure and during his teaching periods and during his office hours, he kind of started to have this realization that even though academics are smart people, but God, some of them are really terrible writers. And what resulted from that confusion is this book. So if you're the kind of person who's in the business of translating your area expertise into understandable language, this book is essentially a must-read because a lot of people, they have all the knowledge in the world. I've met really smart people who can't string 3 words together, and that is because they suffer from one of 2 things. They suffer from the curse of knowledge, which is the inability to imagine that other people might not know what you know, and professional narcissism, which is you want to use all the professional words to communicate with normal people so that you don't really get to the level of your readers. You don't really meet your readers where they are. And essentially, this book makes a case for a classic writing style, which is to lead your readers by the hand and to write in a way that's both beautiful to read and enjoyable to follow. My favorite chapter is chapter 2, A Window Onto the World, where Pinker essentially argued that your job as a writer is to point out things in the world that you can see as an expert, but to communicate it in a way through the perspective of your readers, to guide them gently through examples, with the ultimate aim of guiding your readers to see the world as you see it as the domain expert. And alongside really interesting discussions about how memory works and how writing fits into how memory works, there are also these really in-depth diagrams about how grammar is supposed to work. And the last chapter, which is the fattest chapter out of this entire book, is basically debunking common grammar myths that people tend to enforce if they're really sticklers about grammar. Things like, should you split an infinitive? Things like, is it okay to end a sentence with a preposition? All that kind of stuff. If you're confused about grammar, this book will clear all of that stuff up and more. And then again, like all the other books that I've recommended this week, it's a really fun read. Do me a favor, do not carry this book onto the subway, because you will distract everyone who's riding in the subway, because you're going to laugh your head off. It's really rare to have such a book where it's written by a really, really smart person with deep domain expertise, but they're able to maintain that kind of conversational and witty voice. And that's kind of what I'm striving for with my writing on my newsletter, A Mug of Insights. And that's also what I'm striving for as I'm writing this book that I'm currently working on. So yeah, a brilliant book if you want to translate your deep insights into witty and understandable language. So there you have it, folks. 5 books on some seemingly boring subjects that are actually fun to read. And I think you're going to get a lot of value out of these books. And most importantly, I think you're going to have a lot of fun reading these. That's kind of the ultimate goal, right? We want to make learning about language or learning about how to read and write really fun. Leave me your thoughts down below. Have you read some of these books? What are your thoughts on them? I want to know all about it, and I'll try my best to reply to the comments that come in within the first hour. But nevertheless, that's all we have for this week's program. We will see you next week with more. Robin Waldun here. Take care and goodbye.